Today I wanted to talk about non-rendered rendering recipes, which is to say, basically, methods or a series of steps for getting to different types of drawing style end results in products. So first of all, the overarching theme of this assignment is that mimesis, which is to say, mimicking reality, is not all that it's caught up, all that it's made out to be. That, as we've seen, it's really hard to do large-scale photographic style renderings. It's just a lot of detail, a lot of lighting, a lot of materials that have to be created. So on this assignment, we're going to mash up different types of views taken out of our software, and this includes using entourage, stylistic filters, and of course, bold composition. And the hardest part actually is the sort of strategy part, finding a style that you really like in rendering. We often, because of the constraints of software, we often kind of accept the results that come right out of the software. It takes some intervention to create a drawing that has a strong style, a strong character, but that's really important when you're trying to kind of establish the aesthetics of a project. So anyway, first of all, in my simplified mind here, there are kind of three different styles or general approaches. One is what I call real-ish, where you're basically trying to create a view that looks pretty real. And this is what I think you see a lot in studio type of renderings. Slightly more divorced from reality is what I like to call suggestive renderings, where it is real, but images, entourage in particular, are allowed to look more like stickers. Elements can be more iconographic, materials can be simplified. And then finally, there are the sort of deeply photoshopped images, the images where they're not trying to represent reality, they're trying to express some sort of emotional feel for a space or some kind of impact of the design. So let's take a look at some of the examples. And these are culled off of the internet, which I'm sure you've heard of, the World Wide Web. A lot of them are actually off of the American Society of Architectural Illustrators website, which I'll show you here. And in fact, let me just go to Pinterest real quickly to show you where these are linked to. And there's a million different styles. Again, a lot of these are from that American Society of Architectural Illustrators, but you can see there's so many different styles. And a lot just depends on kind of the aesthetic you're going for in your project. Some are more technical, and some are kind of playful, and again, they're just trying to express an aesthetic. So, all right, let's take a look at some of these in greater detail. So these are basically more or less realistic. The people are photographic. They are not semi-opaque. They are opaque. The materials look pretty real. They have done some fun things like make the lines look more hand-drawn, but in the end, this was all done on the computer. And same with this one. Again, this is most likely a kind of SketchUp overlay where they have created some daylighting, emphasized it with some photoshopping techniques, added in a few shadows here and there. But basically, this is not meant to be a photograph, but it is meant to show more or less realistically what the space is supposed to look like. Very similar. Again, I believe these are the same artist here because the people are the same from one drawing to the next. And we're familiar with these, and you can get these highly photographic effects pretty simply, just by using materials and a little bit of photoshopping. This one isn't rendered. You can see that the lighting doesn't. It's very flat, but the materials have a nice look to them nonetheless. And again, here, putting in shadows, putting in sky, making bright spots that kind of almost burn the camera view out. Or even this one, which is starting to use the semi-opaque people. There's something about that look, and in particular trees seem to look very good with that method. But if you look in the foreground at the concrete material, it is a very realistic looking material. The grain on the wood is somewhat realistic, although the end grain doesn't show up right. But anyway, so these are sort of starting to veer away from pure reality. Also note the lack of handrail on those stairs. Very bad. Anyway, or something like this, which has a real look to it. You can see they've used a photograph for the person and the coffee, which is kind of out of perspective. But what they're looking at in the distance is actually a section perspective. So you don't see that in reality. People don't go and saw through entire buildings, but they're really starting to use architectural conventions here for graphics more than they are just trying to represent reality. Now, as we get farther from reality, and this, many of you will recognize this is pretty much a straight out of SketchUp kind of view, but they've applied a light filter to it, some photoshopping to make it look like there's electric lighting going on, and of course some photographic people. Once you kind of make that decision to veer away from full-on reality, you can do one of the simplest things you can do is start to use non-photographic people and more aggressive filtering. So these people are shadow people, gray, semi-opaque people. It can get some very interesting effects. And of course, the background image is probably wherever this project is located. But it's been faded out, so to help you emphasize in this case, the greenery. And they've used photographs of greenery, carefully cropped and color controlled. So, and there's a lot of different examples of the ways you can do this. This one uses the more sketchy lines, and again some fancy footwork in Photoshop to make it look like the lights are on and that it's a daylight view. And SketchUp will produce shadows which are realistic to the location that you're in without much change, as can Revit, of course. So you can use those, and of course you can use rendered views underneath these photoshopped views. So even something like this, which has the look of a truly photoshopped or a truly rendered view, but they have done some photo manipulation with the scale figures, and the sky to me looks like they've manipulated it to be a little more dramatic. Or something like this. Again, if you look at the vehicles, they don't look realistic. And what they've done in this one is applied a filter to the entire rendering. Again, it's looks SketchUp-y to me, probably due to the 3-point perspective. But by using non-realistic trees, non-realistic people, in theory, it's supposed to help you to focus on the design, which is not particularly nice. So anyway, and here's another example. Again, we're kind of going over this. This is supposed to have a hand-drawn look. Most likely, the kind of watercolory effects were done in Adobe Illustrator. A lot of those effects are actually easier to achieve in Illustrator. And all these drawings, by the way, can be exported from SketchUp or even Revit as DWG files, which can be read by Adobe Illustrator as vectors, which is super nice for rendering plans, of course, but in this case for controlling lines, line weight, the stroke color, and width. So anyway, and this is actually an Endicott student, again, overlaying images that have been heavily filtered. Her goal was not to represent reality, it was to kind of capture a moment in time in her project, and kind of the feel for the space. That I think that if this was a photorealistic view, I'm sure it would be very nice, but somehow it doesn't capture the same moment that this more soft, moody type of rendering captures. So finally, once you just sort of say, I'm not even going to try to make it realistic. I'm just going to try and capture the expressive spirit of the place. Well, then you can just really cut loose. Again, this is an Endicott student, and this is a project which you can do. It's a school bus, and she liked the idea of the tumble bus. Some of you from New England may be familiar with the tumble bus, school bus, fitted out with padding that the kids can go bananas in. And anyway, it's not photorealistic. Even though these are photographic people, they have been heavily filtered, as has the background image. She started by kind of modeling blocks inside the bus, but basically took that colored rendering and just applied very aggressive filtering. There is an image outside the window, but it's also been heavily filtered because that's not important. It's the kids having fun in the space that is important. And even the kind of bold cropping, she's broken away from the rectangle to create a more bold look to the perimeter of the drawing, is very effective. So, and there's a number of different approaches. It doesn't always have to have bold cropping. In this case, this is a photorealistically rendered view of a project which they have done some very aggressive filtering in Photoshop. You might say, well, if they went through all that effort to photorealistically render, why are they doing this aggressive filtering? And again, it's to capture kind of the spirit of the space without distracting with all the details. So anyway, and there's plenty of examples of these. Some of these kind of look very sci-fi-ish. And some of them are trying to kind of capture a moment in time that is reminiscent of a different period in history. In this case, the sort of 1970s Vegas Strip kind of look. Or just purely a vignette. Notice in this case, the background is extremely heavily blurred, which is a very nice technique for adding depth to a drawing. But in this case, again, they're not trying to represent every, mote of dirt on the wall in the background. They're just trying to capture kind of the spirit of this particular project. It is, of course, photorealistic, but the heavy blurring makes it dramatic and artistic. So anyway, and these types of approaches can work for orthographic drawings too. Just a few examples, and again, these are from my Pinterest page that I've kind of collected them if you want to look at those. This is an overlay of what looks like, a kind of rendering approach, overlaid with basically a series of sectional drawings. Very interesting. The graphics are very nice, but the overlay just gives it kind of a layering that is very balanced, but also kind of interesting. Each layer can be read on its own. Or something like this. This is an Adobe Illustrator rendering, I think, or maybe Photoshop, not entirely sure. But the blackness of the poche is so dramatic. It really focuses your eye on the interiors. There's probably a lot of detail that's been left out, things like wall bases and where actually are all these lights coming from. But boy, it's a dramatic presentation drawing. Or something like this, a perspectively exploded, what Revit speak would call a displacement view, rendered in a kind of dramatic, non-realistic or semi-realistic way. Boy, that talks a lot about the project, and of course, this is probably a huge drawing. So, anyway, how do you do all these drawings? That's the big question, right? And the process, some of them, of course, are using software to get photorealistic base images that we're not using, like V-Ray. We don't have that kind of horsepower. However, we can get more very, very adequate renderings right out of our tools available for us. First of all, configure the view that you like. That's the most important thing, and we've already had an exercise in composition. And then export different types of views, different kind of view settings without changing the perspective or cropping. So that you might have a sketchy view, a realistic view, maybe even a view with lighting rendered in it. And then we're going to composite them in Photoshop. Compositing basically means, blending different layers in different ways. You can selectively erase parts of drawings. You can filter them. There's also blending modes and materials. And the previous video did kind of talk about how to blend layers that were taken out of SketchUp. Revit does also have these potential for different layering, different styles, view styles, shaded, realistic, and all that, and of course rendered. And you can get more than adequate results from Revit as well. There is also lighting and entourage, which is covered separately in a separate video called Entourage and Touch-Up. So in my mind, SketchUp has the most options, not just because I am notorious for liking SketchUp, but I believe the line options are the greatest. Revit, you can get a sketchy view, and you can even have X-ray applied to your sketchy views, but you can't get those nice solid lines with the crossing at the end of the lines quite like you can in SketchUp. That's my personal feeling. They don't look quite as dramatic. But ultimately, the process is the same. You export the Revit. If you want to export your model from Revit to SketchUp, you can use Qubity makes an exporter. It's called RVT to SKP, and it's on the desktop machines. And what I would recommend though is that you use a section box to crop your model in the 3D axonometric view, so that you don't export everything, because that does make for a rather large SketchUp file. Anyway, and then once you bring it into SketchUp, you can save a bunch of views for easy navigation and use styles for different types of scenes. So a couple of samples, and these are sort of taken from the more or less realistic, sort of realistic, and then not so realistic views. First of all, in this recipe, they basically have taken a shaded view, probably overlaid that with a sketchy line work view, cut and pasted in cropped images of sky and people. They also have used what look like photorealistic, perspectively corrected images of grass and other materials. So, materials, get smaller as they get farther away, right? The trees get smaller, the grass, even the stone on the building. Often what's done is they adjust the exposure of each layer so that it is composed nicely. The sky, in this case, has a nice light look toward the horizon, but darker in the foreground. Trees are not allowed to get too overwhelming. Anyway, and often people will apply an effect on a flattened version of the image. Sometimes just noise. A filter called noise will just soften everything, but you can go more aggressive, but that's a good one. So another sample recipe, and this is from the Endicott student, very similar, textured view, textured by which I mean it has materials on it, sketchy line work also, but and corrected people and images. They've included shadows and reflections, but then they've added blur effects. They've also added some lighting effects to kind of make it look like there's glare coming from the window, kind of bold spots on the image. And then they've gently blended the overall image to get a nice effect. Now, on option number 3, they also started with a very similar view, but in this case, they've gone much more aggressive. This is, of course, a SketchUp-based file, so they have different options for hand-drawn line work, and in this case it's obviously a very heavy, almost marker-like line work, and that can actually be enhanced somewhat in Photoshop. There are a lot of shadows, but they've also created shadows using plastic wrap or other filters in Photoshop that are sort of real, but also they sort of make them surreal, kind of a layering effect. And they have included lighting effects. They have softened the background image and blurred it, and lowered its saturation so it doesn't distract. And of course, they've added blending effects on the overall image. What's interesting in this one is that they have added selectively more powerful filters to different scale figures. So figures in the background are blurrier and figures in the foreground are brighter, but they've applied some lighting to each of them so that it seems like the light is coming from a consistent location. And finally, this image, which was just starting with a photograph. It did not start with a computer model at all. And the advantage of that is, of course, if you are doing like a historic preservation type of project, you're not going to model this puppy in Revit. It's just too onerous. This is a castle in Austria somewhere. And yeah, so you just, if you have a good photograph, you can do a number of different things. Some are very similar to what we do with the other images, putting in perspective corrected images, shadows, reflections. But in this case, they've actually put in furniture from Revit, where they chose the furniture they want, put it in the perspective view that matches the photograph. So, which is not a simple task, but does allow you to basically export an image of the furniture from Revit. And of course, we all know you export those images with the alpha channel active, and then you can just paste them right into Photoshop. You don't have to crop them or anything. So anyway, this one also has a very aggressive filter on top of the image. And what that does, and you may have to sort of stick your face close to the screen to see it, but what that does is it kind of blends everything together so that it actually does look like it's all one composition, even though you have photographs taken from different angles. By blending it and by a little bit of light touch on the lighting direction on each person, you can get a pretty good look. So anyway, that's the basic idea, and the big thing is allow your sort of artistic side to come forward in this project. Try to really capture the spirit of your project, and try to also take note of the steps that you used to get your rendering, because then you're going to have to reproduce it on a second one. And then it kind of becomes your style when you do that.